Second. My name is Anthony Kaufman. I'm a senior programmer at the Chicago International Film Festival, and I head up our Industry Days programming. We're excited to once again be collaborating with Independent Film Alliance Chicago on these town halls. Thank you so much, Angie. We will be having another one soon, so please check your emails for that. We do have an event coming up next week that I did want to give a shout out to for industry folks. We're doing a panel on sound professionals in conjunction with the Chicago Film Office about sound working with posts right now in the middle of COVID. If people could shoot, then how are they going to do sound editing, recording, and mixing? So that is on the 15th, I believe. Please look out for that, register for that. I am going to disappear and let Angie and Betsy take it from here. Thanks very much, Angie, and thanks very much, panelists, for joining us.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, panelists, for being here. This is a really important and exciting town hall. We're going to be talking about the some recent insurance and legal issues surrounding our industry. And I really want to thank our panelists, Chris Johnson, Kwame Amoaku, Brenda Robinson, Tom Leavens, and a really special shout out to Congressman Danny Davis of the 7th District of Illinois. So honored to have you here with us, Congressman. There's an awful lot happening in Washington. You have served this state so well, and this is just yet another sign of your steadfast commitment to people of Chicago and the people of Illinois, and especially our industry. And we are just so grateful to have you here. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's our pleasure to be with such a distinguished group, discussing issues that are very important to the economy of our environment, but very important overall. And so we thank you for what it is that you do and how much you mean to Chicago and the rest of the world, quite frankly.
Well, thank you, Congressman. We appreciate that. I would like to start with each of our panelists just giving a 30-second background of who they are and what they are doing. And then I'm going to quickly throw to Kwame, who's going to tell us a little bit about the background and sort of the landscape for phase 4, which we have entered in Chicago production. And because I know Kwame's on a really tight schedule and is going to have to run. So if we could just start, and again, with just a very quick intro from each of you and tell us what your background is and why you're here today. If we could just start with Chris Johnson.
All right, thank you. My name is Chris Johnson. I own Johnsonese Brokerage. We are an entertainment insurance agency. We work out of the Stage 18 office at CineSpace. We insure a lot of indie productions in Chicago and statewide. And I'm also a board member of the Independent Film Alliance. So discussion.
Thank you, Chris. I'd next like to go to the extraordinarily wonderful Brenda Robinson, who I'm proud to call my friend and colleague. Brenda, if you could give us a little bit of background. You need to unmute.
I'm just saying, when you said extraordinary, I was looking at Congressman Davis and thought he was going next. As Betsy mentioned, I'm Brenda Robinson. I'm an entertainment attorney and Chicago native. I work in music, film, and television. On the film side, representing a lot of production companies, talent, and financiers. I also wear a second hat as a partner in a film fund called Game Changer Films. And so we provide equity financing for narrative films as well as television series. And lastly, I am a proud board member of Cinema Chicago and act as official legal counsel for the Chicago International Film Festival. Very excited to be here.
Thanks, Brenda. Tom Leavens is a really great force in our local industry. He was, I believe, the original executive director of Lawyers for the Creative Arts. who
Right.
I'd like to mention is partnering with us on this town hall today. And you're going to hear more at the end of this conversation about some upcoming, very specific legal presentations and conversations that they're going to be holding. This is sort of a kickoff to that series that LCA is going to be putting on. LCA has been offering legal advice to people in the arts for decades. They are an absolute civic treasure that we have here in Chicago and the greater Illinois area. And I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Well, thank you, Betsy. That was terrific. I really appreciate that, and LCA appreciates that too. That for the creative arts was my start as an attorney and in Chicago here, and I've been practicing in entertainment media law since I came out of law school. And I am now a partner with the firm Mandell Menkes in Chicago, and I divide my time between Chicago and Park City, where I am right now. And I'm also very involved with Chicago Media Angels, on the board of advisors of that organization, which many of you know as being a funder of film and television productions. And I'm excited to be here. This is great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And Kwame, you want to give, for those of, everybody knows Kwame, of course, but for those of you who maybe this is your first time on the line with Kwame, you can give us a quick background?
Hello, Kwame Amoaku. I'm the director of the Chicago Film Office, working with the Department of Cultural Affairs, especially the city. Our job is to facilitate film production and as well as the cultural aspects of film in the city of Chicago.
Great, thank you. And then Congressman, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to your introduction that I gave you before, but I would love to have you say a few words about your work for Illinois.
Well, thank you very much. And I will just emphasize that as a person, long before becoming an elected official, I had a great deal of interest in the creative arts. People who know me know that I love spoken word. I'm always talking about something. I've read 2 books during the pandemic. You know, if you're at home, I've watched a lot of creative things, but I also represent the most faculties of geography in North America, pressed into a political subdivision. My district includes downtown Chicago, the Gold Coast, the Magnificent Mile. It includes the home of CineScope. And as a matter of fact, some of my dear friends have gotten involved. Ed Smith, who was the alderman for the 28th Ward for about 28 years, and my best friend in politics, now works at CineScope. He's actually working there after he retired. Ricky Hendon, who used to be called Hollywood Hendon, the state senator, was kind of like the main guy in Springfield when he was there, pushing and trying to represent the film industry. And he became a movie maker himself. And actually, both and I movie, I think he called it Butterscotch and Chocolate. The reviews weren't, you know, they were what they were. But also all of the west side of Chicago, of course, is mine, as well as the western suburbs. I live in a historic area, and so many movies are actually shot on my street. Down the street, I live in the Austin community. Frank Lloyd Wright was there, and Frederick Schock, and you know, there are a lot of trees. They're cutting the one down in front of my house today. But I've always been interested in this industry, and so I know a fair amount about what goes on with it. by virtue of the contacts that I have with individuals who are involved on a regular basis. And I'm just pleased to represent the kind of diversity. I've got more hospitals in my district than any other single district in the United States of America. I've got as many colleges and universities in my district as many other states have in their states. So all of this is fascinating and great, and I'm just pleased to be a part of this discussion today and find out how we can also try and get some of the resources increased in relationship to what we need from the pandemic. And thank you very much, and I'm pleased with that.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And that's a perfect segue into Kwame. If you want to just give us a brief on phase 4 of opening back up for business and how it is affecting our industry, will be a perfect basis to get into our further discussion.
Well, I try not to be too political sometimes and you know, separate these thoughts and ideas that different people have, other than to say that we are 535 members of Congress who've been elected by the people of the United States to represent their hopes, needs, aspirations, desires, and all of us try and do that often from a different vantage point. So I'll say that the other side, if you will, seem to be moving a little bit to another phase of relief. I mean, we passed in the House of Representatives about 3 weeks or so ago, the HEROES Act, which I consider to be one of the best pieces of legislation that I've seen since I've been working in public office. That it's just very good. It's fairly comprehensive. You never get comprehensive enough, but it provides resources to help stimulate the economy, get us back on track, to help keep people at work, to provide assistance to the business and industries that have been damaged and that have been hurt. And we're hoping, I mean, the warm up is an indication that we are going to have another phase of relief. We've really gotten around to where the president and the Senate are sort of acknowledging that we really need to do this and we must do it. So all of us will be trying to help shape it in such a way that it will deal with the diverse needs of our economy. You know, and I think all aspects. We also think that we've tightened up some of the money that's going to be available, some of the resources that businesses and business interests will be able to acquire, and that it will not be as one-sided as it has been. You know, if you've got a piece of pie and one part gets too much, there's not much left for the other. And so we're trying to change that by making that some of the smaller business entities, as well as the larger business entities, get a cut at the apple and are able to get a slice of that. And that to me includes everybody. I mean, you can't leave out. I'm a guy who liked to catch a blues act every once in a while. And so the guys with the little clubs, you know, who have been hurt and damaged, they need help.
Yeah.
The theaters need help because they've been closed and they need help. So we need to try and make it as comprehensive. And that's what I, of course, will be doing. And I think that's what the House bill that's already passed, we call it the HEROES Act.
Right.
Individuals in health and medicine have been so gracious as to provide their services, often putting themselves in danger to do that. So of course the hospitals and health centers and all of these individuals are taken care of.
Yes.
But it does look like we're going to have another round.
Yeah, it
How
does.
long that's going to take? Well, you know, we're out. We'll go back in next week. I mean, week after next, quite frankly, for the House. And we will work on the appropriation process. And I hope that the Senate will have that we can negotiate with them about to get the next phase rolling.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Congressman, and we really appreciate this work. And I know people are going to have a lot of questions for you about the current PREA bill, but before we get there, Kwame, could you just give us sort of the state of the city and production?
So we have entered into phase 4 in the city, and we have released the COVID guidelines for filming in phase 4, which align themselves primarily with the zone system that is in the so-called white paper that was distributed by the unions. So we feel like that will allow large-scale film production to proceed as long as they're adhering to these guidelines. Some of the larger organizations have indicated production again in the next couple of upcoming months, so we're looking forward to that. Basically, we're pushing the idea that we are ready and we are open for filming here with the guidelines in mind. Hopefully, we're working on the guidelines to have access to the same type of zone filming system that the larger shoots do, i.e. the commercial shoots, the independent shoots, working on protocols for them with the Department of Health. Of course, the travel ban is placing a restriction on the ability for productions to bring above the line people in from Los Angeles right now. That's something that is definitely tied to the health metrics that exist, and it's kind of outside of our ability to change that. We are looking for a flow to allow some exemptions to take place based on the fact that Zone A people are tested extremely frequently, and that might be enough for the health department to give them an exemption. So we're looking at trying to organize that right now. And
Right.
But other than the travel ban, it's full speed ahead for production in the city of Chicago.
Which is, of course, wonderful news that we've all been waiting for. And as it relates to independent production, it definitely brings up a new set of questions about insurance and some of the legalities involved with restarting production. And I'd like to highlight the fact that big studio productions and network productions have you know, their corporate insurance that comes with being a part of their productions. Independent productions are not that lucky, and therefore independents are scrambling to figure out how they're possibly going to be able to insure their projects. And I'm wondering if, Chris, you can talk a little bit about, as an independent insurer, what your thoughts are there, and if you have any helpful insights to share with our audience.
Yeah, definitely. So the comments I make will be relevant to indie productions, you know, up to the single-digit millions. Things get a little different as you get into very large projects, but and I don't want to tell you how to build a watch when you ask me to tell the time, but I did want to get a little bit of background on insurance, so things that are happening maybe make a little bit more sense to people. And one of the things to think about is that insurance is a pooling of risk. So everybody pays in a small amount of money to insure the risk of if they have a major loss, and then the insurance company pays that loss. So it's a sharing of risk amongst all the policyholders. Insurance determines how much to pay or how much to charge you based on historic data. So if you take a simple example of rented equipment insurance, insurance companies have all this data that says on average of every so many rentals, this many cameras will be broken, or this many cameras will be stolen, and this is how much on average it costs. So that's how they determine how to charge you for insurance. So when we're living in the world of a pandemic, it creates two major problems for insurance companies. One is we don't have historic data on COVID-19. So it's really hard to figure out prices. We don't have any data that says, if you have a film crew of 150 people, on average, how many of them are going to catch COVID? We don't have good data on how many people develop severe symptoms and how many people will die of those people. So that's a big problem. There's also the issue that if something affects everyone, it doesn't fit the insurance model anymore. So if you think about fire insurance, a very simple form of insurance, because not every house typically burns down at once. But if every home in America had a fire at the same time, the insurance industry would collapse. And so that's also the risk with a pandemic, is that if everyone has a claim at the same time, there's not enough funds to possibly cover it. But the other thing I want to remind you is that insurance is a for-profit business, and the only way they make money is by selling insurance. So they do want to sell insurance. The question is just, how can you make it work in this environment? And so we can quote insurance for productions right now. We have quoted projects. We had, one project shoot recently, but there are going to be restrictions, and there are really 5 coverages that I can think of that are really sort of directly impacted by COVID-19. And those are CAS coverage, civil authority coverage, imminent peril coverage, workers' comp, and to a lesser extent, general liability. And so I don't know, Betsy, if you want me to take the time to maybe just talk about each of those a little, or if that was enough of an overview.
Let's start with the overview. And I want to jump to a couple of other things. And then I do think, Chris, people will have some follow-up questions they may ask you more specifics from. I want to bring Brenda and Tom in for a moment. We'll start with Brenda and just ask you, this is a big, broad question, I know, but, what type of legal issues should production people be aware of due to COVID-19 and getting back to work?
Well, first of all, start by covering the top legal issues that right now from clients that several of my colleagues are on from Swanson, Martin, and Bell. So thanks, guys. We're all kind of in it together trying to respond to our clients. So first and foremost, it goes back to basic contract issues. We're getting a lot of questions from clients asking things like, how can I manage a contract that can't be performed as a result of cancellations? We're seeing obviously a lot of questions around whether or not parties can still get paid for contracts that are in process, or can a party actually demand a refund, or is there a legal justification for non-payment or non-performance? Of course, obviously getting lots of questions about whether any of these insurance provisions are actually applicable. Separate from this, there are lots of questions about how COVID-19 is actually going to affect the future of financing, which is quite relevant, because obviously when you think about insurance issues, one thing that producers need to be aware of is obviously we probably should expect to see, and Chris can speak to this, increases in premiums, especially if we want to have COVID-19 exceptions. There are a lot of people that are asking about whether they can extend contracts. And so what we're seeing is, even as production has come to a halt, development, ironically, continues in earnest. And so we still have clients. So this is the good news, is that people are still developing projects. They're still writing scripts. They're still looking to finance things. So investors are still very active right now, which I think is great news for filmmakers, because the bottom line is everyone is hopeful that obviously when we come out of this, we're going to be starved for content. So you've got this backup of projects that need to get finished, that were already mid-production, but then you've got a lot of great ideas that were just being developed that will need to be actually produced once we come out of this. And so as we creep back into this new normal, What we're seeing legally is that clients are literally saying, can I extend my option contract, for example? You know, when you're given a certain amount of time to develop an idea, say 12 to 18 months, people are saying, can we go back to the rights holder and ask to extend this by 3 months or 6 months, or frankly, in a more open-ended way, can we just extend this for the life of the pandemic? And then recently, actually just in the last 2 days, we've seen a couple of lawsuits pop up where movie theaters, at least on the East Coast, are beginning to sue the government for keeping theaters closed. And so the constitutional argument is that obviously churches and other large venues are allowed to open, so why can't people gather in theaters? It's a really interesting argument, frankly, based on a First Amendment argument, equal protection and due process, that they are not allowed to congregate in the same way. That all impacts the financing in this industry. And so these are very important legal questions to think about. But what we are advising people going forward is that obviously, given that this is a case of first impression for everyone, lawyers and insurance companies alike, it's really requiring lawyers to come up with very creative arguments for how they can go about trying to enforce some of the coverage that's there. And there's obviously great understanding that insurance companies are not going to want to account for this early on. You know, when we've had prior outbreaks like SARS and Ebola years ago, there were some changes in policies then, but even then, those policies still didn't contemplate what's going on now. It talked more about acts of God and natural disasters. There really was no reference to pandemics or viruses and things like that. So we're all sort of navigating this together. But what we are advising clients is to think about, as you're budgeting for production, what new things will you need to account for in order to provide a safe work environment? You know, OSHA obviously requires that employers provide a safe and healthy work environment. So what this literally means in this moment is that there will be obviously more provision of PPE for the crew and productions. It's going to be maintaining a stricter set, having less people on. It also means thinking about whether or not insurance premiums would increase, and especially if you want these, or you're probably going to see more liability waivers that are issued. And so producers will need to pay greater attention to developing safety protocols that will allow them to actually maintain a safe set, social distancing, quarantine bubbles. And then as of this morning, there was word that a film was apparently just shot in secret, starring John David Washington. And what they did, and Chris, the question is, were they able to get insurance for that? But what they did was similar to what Tyler Perry is doing in Atlanta. They created a quarantine bubble for that crew. And so they had people come in, everyone had to be in the same place for 2 weeks. They were tested, obviously, almost every day that they were there. Their temperatures were taken in the morning and in the evening. They limited the crew to 12 people on the set at any given time. So we're working very hard, in other words, to try to fight this unknown enemy. And this apparently is going to be the new norm going forward. And so that is going to come with a cost. And so on the financing side, what we're seeing is that people are being a lot more intentional about how they are putting together production budgets and how they're going about raising money and explaining to investors the risks involved, and recognizing that things may take longer. We can no longer rely on the festival launch as a way that we have about being in this new digital space, and the fact that this may be the new way that obviously impacts an investor's analysis of whether or not they'll hedge risk in this business, because we don't know what we'll be able to recoup given that this is the new paradigm. So we are flooded with issues and questions that we're all sort of confronting together. And so the positive side of this is that we're all dealing with it, and so we're all creating a solution, and we will eventually, as a community, as a legal community, and as a film community, come together to come up with a set of protocols that we can apply across the board.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was really very, very helpful and insightful. Tom, are you seeing in your practice the same issues that Brenda has been addressing, or any different ones, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that was very comprehensive, Brenda. Terrific job. And I concur with everything that you said. I made a couple notes here, and they're mostly on the financing side. And that is that film is already viewed in many respects as a high risk kind of thing. And for people don't necessarily understand what a project is going to come laden with if it's produced during a time that there are a lot of very strict protocols about how the production ought to take place. And you don't necessarily know when a claim is going to arise. It may be some time afterwards, maybe months, or maybe a year, some hidden costs that people need to take into account today that they didn't before. The other is just trying to measure what the possible return is going to be for a film, because we don't understand necessarily how film content is going to be consumed going forward. We see that change is going to occur. We don't know the full implications of that. We don't know what all the business models are going to be. So investors have to take into account that additional uncertainty about, as you mentioned, Brenda, that the festival model is going to be very different, and how many people are going to be going into theaters, and how important is that going to be? Even when we get past the actual threat of infection, how are people's behavior going to be changed, and what that impact is going to be on revenue. So those are just a couple additional points that I thought of what Brenda had mentioned.
Right. Well, thank you. That's really helpful. And before we move to some specific questions that are coming from the audience, I wanted to also set the sort of scene and landscape up with talking a little bit about the Pandemic Response Insurance Act, PREA, House Bill 7011, if I have that correct, Congressman. And Congressman Davis is a co-sponsor of that. And that is set up to try to help be an insurance backstop, if I'm saying that correctly. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and then throw it to Chris to get his thoughts on how, if PREA, which is very similar to TRIA, which was passed in the wake of 9/11 as the Terrorism Response Insurance Act, disasters that none of us could have predicted, in impacting the insurance industry on small businesses. So, Congressman, do you want to tell us a little bit about why you decided to be a co-sponsor of PREA, or any of the facts involved with it?
Well, you know, complexity is a real part of life now, and especially as we relate to the impact of the pandemic. And I'm not an economist, but my theories and thoughts about economy is that as long as you can keep movement and exchange of goods, services, resources, thoughts, and ideas flowing, that this keeps an economy moving. And every aspect of it have to be fed. I always say that the movement of money and resources and activity is like blood to the body. And if all the blood drains out, I don't care how efficient our physicians are or what kind of medical equipment we have, you're going to be impacted negatively. And if we can't sustain any aspect of what we've learned to become, then that's a takeaway, because that activity is not going on. And so we have to protect every aspect the best way that we can. The good thing about the federal government, that's a little different than state governments and local governments, is the ability to borrow in a different way. You don't necessarily have to have a budget that you've demonstrated how you're going to pay for whatever it is that you do. I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee is the main tax writing committee. Some people have called it the most important committee because it was the first committee established. And there are 18 people who've served on it who became president of the United States. We write the tax law primarily coming out of the House of Representatives. But we also can determine, along with the rest of our colleagues, that we invest a certain way. I don't call it spending so much as I call it investment. And you invest because you believe in the future and you believe that you're going to be able to work through and work out the challenges and difficulties that you're facing. And so those are the reasons. I mean, I want to keep, for example, as we deal with the CARES packages and all, we want to get people back to work as quickly as we can.
Exactly.
We want them working. We want to do it safely and as safely as possible, but we need people to go to work.
Yeah,
we need the theaters to be open and people to make use of them because so many of our people have come to rely upon. So those are the reasons that I support protecting that we can, the resources, the industries, and the business activity of, for example, restaurants in my district. I represent Greektown. I represent Chinatown. I represent Old Town. I represent Italian Village. I represent Soulville. I represent Ukrainian Village, where the food industry is a big deal in my district. And so I've got to try and protect as much of that as I can. And so that's why I believe that 7011, HR 7011, is a good faith effort.
Yes, it absolutely is. It absolutely is. Yeah. Thank you so much. And Chris, I'm wondering, how would the passage of HR 7011 affect your ability to insure films?
Definitely. Well, first, thank you, Congressman, for co-sponsoring the bill. I think it's an important bill. And Betsy, you made the exact correct analogy with terrorism coverage, that after 9/11, we learned that terrorists could, cause huge destruction, destroy a whole neighborhood in Manhattan, and that it was impossible for private insurance companies to offer terrorism coverage going forward in major cities. And our major cities would have died. What business is going to invest in Manhattan or the Loop in that situation? And so Congress did step in and passed basically government subsidized terrorism coverage. So it's provided through private insurance companies, but the government provides a backstop to cover when big losses happen. And I think the same thing has to happen with, and what I talked about before, that when something affects everyone, the private insurance model doesn't really work anymore. And so government support is needed to make it feasible. But obviously, running it through the private insurance companies helps, because then it can just be a part of your full insurance package that you purchase. It's all handled the same way, so it can make things much more efficient. So certainly across all types of business, if PREA is passed, it will be a major help. In the meantime, we have to live with the reality that we don't have it yet. And so there are going to be restrictions on insurance policies relative to COVID-19 in the meantime. So
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah. I want to go to some specific questions that some audience members have sent in, and I will get through as many of them as possible. I have no idea how our town halls seem to go so fast, but thank you everybody who sent in questions, and I'm just going to start going down a list. One question is, and this might be more of a legal question than anything, which is, can we require crew to provide proof of negative COVID results? And is there room for medical discrimination if we don't allow them on set? There's a tricky one. Tom, you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have an answer to that. I'm sorry. It's an excellent question, but I would refer that to somebody who's an employment attorney. But I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah,
Makes sense?
you know, what I was thinking is that, first of all, you've got privacy considerations to think about. And this also piggybacks on another question I see in here regarding whether you can force people to show up. If it's a critical crew member, can you force them to perform? And I want to answer this not only as a lawyer, but also as a producer. You have to think about whether or not that it actually is the right approach right now, because the issue is, I don't see it so much as a contract or a legal question. It's more of a practical one. If someone is saying that they've tested negative, but or they've been exposed, but you test them and it's negative, or if people feel that they've been exposed and there's a concern on the production that you have these people, I think everyone tends to get caught up in, the formality of it all and trying to cite some legal reason why you should do this or that. And the truth is, because I don't know what we're dealing with, I don't know that that's even the right thing to rely on when thinking about the question. It's the practical thing, because the testing is inconsistent. As we've seen with productions right now, a lot of the TV shows, some soap operas have started to produce. As you saw, they began production after going through this whole entire process of putting in place safety protocols, only to have to cease production again, at least for a day or two, because the testing couldn't keep up with the amount of activity that was going on. We don't know, there are a lot of false positives and things like that. So because it's the science is tricky, I don't know that it's necessarily a legal question. I think we actually don't know if it's safe to have people on set right now, because we don't know if we have the testing that we can rely on, because we're still learning that. And
Right.
So what I'm telling clients is, don't get so wrapped up in the formalities of it all, because I don't even know that I can cite a contract provision right now to even address that. I think I'm actually citing the science of it, saying, practically speaking, I don't know that we can force people onto sets. I don't know that we can keep people off of sets who think they've been exposed or who swear they haven't been exposed, because we don't actually have a consistent mechanism in place right now to actually answer that question from a science perspective.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Martina is wondering the impact, since most contracts are written with a specific time frame for compensation and such, is there a way to spread the risk that you guys can think of, how to share the risk among all the parties in a way that's fair, how contracts can be drawn that protect everybody from sort of last minute cancellations? I mean, we all know the way that any change in a production schedule, dollars start being spent very, very quickly. I don't know if anybody went on that.
How to spread the risk? I mean, normally that's the kind of thing that happens in the indemnification provisions of the agreement. And I suppose there might be something that could be done there. Those usually involve some kinds of warranties and representations that are made, as far as there being, say, a non-culpability aspect of this. And I think that's maybe the gist of the question. Like, like this is not something that would fall into that category because nobody is really at fault. They're not to blame for their circumstance. That's an interesting one. I don't know that I've ever drafted anything that other than some kind of a partnership agreement that would allocate the risk of loss, but that creates a very different kind of form parties, which is usually not a partnership. I don't know, Brenda, whether you've got another thought on that, but that's what comes to mind off the top of my head.
I concur with that. I think it also just reflects the fact that we're all kind of developing the legal answers as we go because we haven't been provided precedent with this. And so it goes back to the level of creativity that will be required at this point to come up with the solution, but also consistency. And I want to address that on insurance law. It's a somewhat peculiar area because it's not just legal question, there are also policy questions involved with that, and just trying to understand, there's language of an agreement that can be interpreted in many different ways, and every state has variations of this. And so I want to ask, or just request of Chris and his brethren and the Congressman, that whatever we come up with, that we try to come up with a consistent standard so that we can understand the best way forward. Because right now, the two primary areas of coverage that people are looking at right now, in terms of wanting to invoke a privilege, a provision would be virus exclusion, which most insurance policies don't have, obviously, but also this so-called business interruption. And not to get into the weeds of that too much, but people are figuring out and kind of grasping at straws, trying to figure out, how do I increase coverage to increases, and how can I rely on what I currently have in place to address an issue that's happening right now? And it's, when you look at business interruption, the producers might make the argument that we obviously stop production, so there's a financial loss. But in the insurance world, you actually can't tie the loss, to financial considerations. It actually has to do with physical damage to property, so it doesn't even apply. And you can say, well, a virus is damaging property because the fact that it exists means I can't make use of the space. But then the counter argument is, well, just clean it, and put in place protocols. So again, we don't even have policies to even hang our hats on right now. And so that will be important from a policy standpoint, that whatever is put in place to protect filmmakers, that there's a consistent standard that's developed so that we can know the path forward.
Something I want to address, this would be to Chris about this area, and that is that by analogy, that the issue of fair use under E&O insurance, a lot of those issues were resolved when there were standards that were promulgated within the industry. And as long as you went along with these kinds of principles and standards, then your E&O policy was easier to get. I've been following all the protocols that are being issued in the white papers and things like that, and curious to know the extent to which the protocols that are being advanced there are the kinds of things that are going to form the basis of expediting insurance coverage in this area, because obviously the faster we get to the point of production, being able to get coverage for the production process, then the more comfortable everybody's going to be and the more efficient that we're going to be. Do you have any sense, Chris, whether these kinds of these protocols are being considered by the insurance industry as being something would give them to issue policies?
So, industry standards are very important to insurance companies, that insureds follow the industry standard. So the industry standards of how to act safely in whatever the industry. So yeah, I agree. The insurance industry, like everyone else in the film world, is trying to figure out what are the right protocols that we need to follow going forward. And when there becomes an industry standard, then yes, it will be easier to say, are you following the XYZ protocols? And if you say yes, it speeds up the underwriting process for the insurance company to determine, whether to sell you insurance and what price to sell you. I don't think we've reached that point yet where there is an agreed upon standard. The one, like you mentioned earlier, that I've heard most is the Union White Paper as sort of, you know, the best source right now. But from the insurance standpoint, and this kind of gets approach the business interruption coverage in two different ways. But from the insurance standpoint, the issue is still the data, that we don't have data, reliable data that can be used to determine, basically to predict the future based on past results, again, of saying, if I have a crew of 150 people, how many of them are likely to get COVID? How many of those is likely to be a serious case? How many fatalities could I even have? And until you have that kind of data, the insurance industry is going to really struggle to be able to offer products to cover COVID-19. So in the short term, before we have better data, before we hopefully have PREA, there are going to be restrictions on insurance policies. And I'll go back to business interruption a little bit, because a couple people mentioned that in their questions. And that's not necessarily the relevant coverage to a film production. Business interruption coverage is tied to a play. So it's more of a coverage that's relevant to businesses that have a physical location, a restaurant, or like CineSpace Studios. But for a film production, the relevant coverages tend to be cast coverage, civil authority coverage, and imminent peril coverage. And these, without getting too much in the weeds, are under the inland marine policy and insurance. They're not a commercial property coverage, they're an inland marine coverage. Cast coverage covers the production for delays if a cast member becomes sick or a cast member is injured. Short term, that are not, or just refusing to offer cast coverage at all. They're just like, we just don't have enough information to do that going forward. There are some that are offering it with COVID-19 exclusions. I don't know of any insurance companies right now for productions the size we're talking about that are offering cast coverage that includes COVID-19 coverage. Civil authority coverage pays the production if non-military government authority shuts your production down. The typical examples of that would be, 2 buildings down from where your shoot is, there was a fire. The fire department blocks off the whole street for safety reasons, and you lose a day's production. Another example is a sewer collapses, right? And the sewage department has to close off the street, and you lose a day's of production. Obviously, in this part of the world, we'd be considered with the health department ordering you to shut down because of a COVID-19 outbreak in the area. Again, insurance companies are saying we just don't have the data to do. So as far as I know, there's no one offering civil authority coverage right now for small productions. And the same way with imminent peril. Imminent peril coverage is basically the production acting proactively to avoid a danger that seems imminent. So the easy example is you're shooting in Florida and a hurricane is predicted to come and hit your shoot location. You shut down the shoot and evacuate. The hurricane goes a different direction. You don't have any physical loss. Imminent peril still covers that loss of production because you acted appropriately to protect your cast and crew. It's the same way here. Without data, the insurance companies don't feel they can offer this coverage currently. So I do not know of any insurance companies that are offering imminent peril coverage right now for small productions. So I think that's the honest answer, is that small productions, and small I mean single-digit millions, up to single-digit millions, are not going to have a lot of COVID coverage right now. There's some coverage potentially under workers' comp. There's some limited coverage under general liability, but I think the coverages that are most important to small productions are not going to be available in the short term. And I don't know what short term means. It means either a vaccine, PREA being passed, or enough time passes that we have real data on the effects of the virus so that insurance companies can predict their potential losses if they offer the coverage.
We're seeing the civil authority argument come up in the context mostly of contract enforcements. That's exactly right. It's not productions that are making those claims. It's people saying, you know, there may be boilerplate language in a contract that requires each party to warrant that they'll comply with rules and regulations set by governments. If the government is imposing a shutdown, if there's a closure in effect, then would my performance on this agreement violate that? Or would lack of performance excuse you to that? A very fine distinction. I'm glad you pointed that out, Chris.
Thank you all. We only have a few minutes left, and I do want to leave a last minute of this Indy Town Hall for Tom to give a little bit of a preview of what some LCA offerings are going to be once they start their series up. So I was wondering if Brenda, Chris, and Tom, I think Congressman, this might be a little bit out of your bailiwick, but if Brenda, Chris, and Tom were each to give a piece of extremely important advice to an indie, and let's even talk about a smaller scale indie, something, you know, not much more than a couple $1 million, which is a playground that a lot of people here in Chicago work within. What would be a great succinct piece of advice you would offer on insurance and legal issues for thinking about getting into production? And we can, Chris?
Okay. I would say bring your insurance agent in early and create a dialogue between your insurance agent, your financiers, and your bond company, because it's going to require coordination amongst the three, you know, to really make it happen. What insurance can we put in place to satisfy the financiers, to satisfy the bond company, you know, and some give and take back and forth there. So I would say the earlier the better that, you know, you start that dialogue.
Yeah, great. What about you, Brenda?
I would say as we think about the safety protocols that we discussed earlier that producers have to be mindful of, the key is to document those safety protocols. We always have to be thinking about risk mitigation and just taking steps to actually put in place a plan that will be effective. But beyond that, the most important thing is to surround yourselves with the right advisors who can actually guide you on these issues and let the science guide you, because not everything is a strict or straightforward legal issue. Sometimes it's actually a practical one. As we're all working to navigate the virus together, we actually have to think about both the formal knowledge that we have on how to deal with scenarios, but also the practical knowledge that we'll need to have to actually put together a plan and a strategy that will allow us to resume business.
That's great.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. I think most succinctly, I would say that the merits of the project are never going to overcome the risks that we're looking at today. And there's so many unknowns, and that sometimes things be let go. And that's a hard thing for people to swallow. I'm not advocating for people to give up on their projects, but to have a realistic taking into account all the things that Chris and Brenda said about getting good advice and good people and doing it very early. But ultimately, you got to listen to the reason and the risks. So that would be my advice.
Great. And
Tom,
yeah.
Can I just toss something in, Betsy, real quick?
please.
I was just gonna say, you made me think of advice I give a lot. I work with a lot of really young filmmakers, and a lot of times they're trying to do stunts that maybe are a little above their capabilities, their experience level. And I say, always remember that no film is worth someone dying for, you know, and I think we do have to keep that perspective here, that what we do is important, but people's health and lives are more important. So that's it.
Congressman, do you have anything you'd like to share about, is there anything that we as your constituents can do to help PREA advance through the legislative process?
Yes, I think that there are indeed certain principles that we can operate from the vantage point of. And I always start with the idea that I've got a lot of rights, even as an individual, but my rights end where the next person's rights begin. And I may have a right to certain kinds of activity, but the other person or persons have a right to a certain kind of protection.
Mhm.
The other point is that we are in uncharted waters. As Chris has said a number of times, we don't have all of the data and information that we'd like to have. Congress does a great deal of vetting. If you've got an idea that you think could work, or you've got something that you think could be helpful, share it with somebody and see if you can sell it to them. Then they may be able to help sell it to others to the point where it becomes practice. I say all the time that he or she who whispers down the well, the things he has to say will never make as many dollars as she who climbs a tree and hollers. So if you got a good idea, share it, call up your congressman and say, hey, you know, I think if so and so happened, fine, call up your senator or whoever you want to call, or make others in the industry aware of it, and let's get it out in the public so it can be discussed, it can be analyzed, it can be vetted, and perhaps it ultimately becomes law and practice. This has been very informative and very helpful to me, and I want to thank you for having been a part of it and being able to hear the thoughts and ideas and what it really takes to shape policy and the difficulty of the period. But I always say that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we're going to be able to work our way through this. We're going to be okay. So thank you very much.
That is a terrific way to end this town hall meeting today on a positive note. It was such a privilege to have you here with us, Congressman, and a privilege and a delight to have you all. Tom, I want you to preview what the future LCA specific conversations topics might be.
Okay, thank you. There is a series that Lawyers for the Creative Arts in the City of Chicago have been working on for some time, and this is going to be launched out of these series of town hall meetings that have occurred. The topics that we are going to be covering include rights acquisitions, assembling the production team and the development team, financing, production process itself, and distribution. It will be featured with other attorneys here in Chicago. You'll see the great talent that we have, the attorney talent, the legal bench that we have is terrific in this area, and you'll meet some really good, interesting attorneys who will be part of these programs. And the July 30th is the first of those events. And we really appreciate IFA and all the things that it's done to help us get those launched.
And Cinemago and the Chicago International Film Festival. On behalf of the IFA, I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you to Anthony, Vivian, Mimi, Angie, everybody who made this happen, Brenda, Chris, Tom, Congressman Davis, Kwame, who had to leave us a little while ago. We are so grateful for this opportunity to talk to people, and we really look forward to our next town hall in 2 weeks.
Thanks.
Thank
Anthony,
you.
you have anything to say? All good. Stay
Thank
cool,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.